Good evening all and welcome. Before we begin today's video, a quick announcement. The story at the 40-minute mark has mentions of someone attempting to take their own life. This is something that you'd rather skip through. It's at the 40-minute mark, just skip it in the timestamps. But for now, it's time to get comfortable, as we've got a train to catch, to let the darkness take control. I grew up in the small village of Clayton, West Yorkshire, and worked in one of the textile mills at Great Horton as a youth. Then, I used to travel on the railway to work and back when I can afford it, and I preferred it over taking the trolley buses and trams, which were the only other forms of transport in the Bradford area at the time. At other times I had to walk, because pay in those days was not a lot, and I had to be careful with money. On Fridays I received my week's pay so that I could buy myself fish and chips at tea time, and would then perhaps go to one of the local picture houses, maybe the Plaza or the Grange or the Elysian, after which I would catch the train home. This story takes place in the 1940s, and on an icy winter's night at Great Horton Station, when the moon lit up the landscape with its translucent glow, I waited for the two-coach train to arrive. It was bloody freezing, let me tell you, and I was stamping my feet trying to keep warm. Eventually the train steamed into view. A tank engine was pulling the two coaches, running the bunker first, and I noticed that there were very few passengers on board. I got on the train and quickly found an empty compartment. In a few minutes, the guard gave the right of way, the engine whistled, and the train steamed slowly out of the station. The windows of the compartment were shrouded in vapor as the engine worked hard on the incline towards Clayton. Just beyond the station, the line runs through a cutting and under a road bridge which is midway into the cutting to a footbridge and at the end of the embankment to Clayton Station. As the train passed through the cutting, the compartment suddenly went icy cold, and the steam from the engine cleared, revealing a woman's face pressed against the window pane. For no apparent reason, the sounds of the train died away and was replaced with complete silence, but the ghastly, twisted face of the woman was still glued to the window. It was horrible. It was as if she were trying to get onto the train. For what seemed like an eternity, I cowered in a corner of my seat, frozen with terror, my eyes wide open with shock. Then as suddenly as the face had appeared, it vanished. The sounds of the train's movements returned, and the train steamed into Clayton Station. I staggered out of the train and almost collapsed into the arms of the guard. I blurted out my story, and the guard nodded sympathetically. He'd heard it all before. According to this guard, I had just seen the ghost of Fair Becca. Apparently, a long time ago, Becca was having an affair with another man, but her husband found out and took her life from her, and then threw her body down a well near Brackenhill Park. The ghost of Becca is said to haunt the area along the railway line, and some nights I can still see that distorted face staring at me through the window. My story takes place one dark night in late autumn at the cherry tree sidings at Hexthorpe, 1 mile west of Doncaster. The sidings were in those days used mainly for coal and coal empties traffic. It was while shunting empty coal wagons that the following incident took place. My second man and myself were looking through the rear windows of our diesel locomotive, awaiting a signal from the yard staff. After a minute or so, the shunter signaled us with his lamp to proceed down the yard to attach a rake of wagons. As I turned to open the power controller on the locomotive, I noticed the figure of a man coming across the adjoining tracks towards us. He appeared to be dressed in a lightly coloured mackintosh and cap. I lowered the cab window and shouted, "Hey, where do you think you're going?" He ignored my question and now had reached the line on which we stood. Although I could clearly see his outline and had no doubt whatsoever it was a man, I could not see his face or features, only his cap and dark mask where his face would normally be. By now he had passed out of my line of sight at the rear of the locomotive. Turning to my second man, I said, "Has that bloke come out clear on your side?" "No, there's no one here." At the same time, we both climbed down the steps at either side and met at the rear center. The man was nowhere to be seen. By now, the shunter had walked up the siding where we stood and asked what was wrong. I told him what happened, and the three of us again searched all around, to no avail. There was no sign of anyone. The shunter said he had heard of the ghost of a man sitting on the buffer stops at the end of the sidings, but thought that his mates were trying to frighten him. But now he wasn't so sure. 2 weeks later, I was in the signalling box at St. James Junction, which is at the opposite end of Hexthorpe Yard to where the story took place. I was waiting to conduct a Tinsley train crew to Decoy Marshing Yard in Doncaster. During my conversation with the signalman, I mentioned the ghost. He was very startled and uneasy for a minute or so, and then went on to tell me what happened the last time he had been on nights in that box. He had a train of wagons bound for Warth-on-Dearne stood in his section, and the brake van was about 20 yards beyond the signal. All was quiet when all of a sudden he heard someone shouting. Before he could get to the door, the box burst open, and in staggered a guard. According to the signalman, the poor fellow was in such a state that he could neither speak nor stand. "I sat him down and quickly made him a cup of tea," said the signalman. After a while, the guard who was in charge of the train outside the signal box was able to tell him what happened. He had been sitting quietly in his brake van waiting for the train to move off when the rear door of the van opened, and a man in a light raincoat had walked in and without saying a word had gone out the other door without opening it. In other words, he had walked through a closed door. It was obvious it was the same ghost as the one I had seen weeks earlier. Who he was or why he was there, I don't know to this day, but I do know he was there, and perhaps still is. At the turn of the 20th century, I was an engine driver for the Great Northern Railway, and I had been recently qualified to be passed on to be a driver on express passenger trains. And one night I was rostered to drive one of Ivart's brand new C1 Atlantics on an express service to the north. Our train was meant to be leaving King's Cross at 8:30, but we left 4 minutes late. I can't tell you what it was, bear in mind, I'm not the kind of lad that gets nervous easily, but that night, on that engine, is an exception. Now I don't know anything about ghosts or spirits or apparitions, but I'm ready to swear to you before any judge that I saw something that night, and no amount of argument will change my belief. It was just when we were passing through Hatfield town when I would take my oath for all that I am worth, that a man stepped from the platform to the footplate of the engine with absolute ease. Bear in mind we were travelling over 55 miles an hour, and I can see his face and what he was wearing to this day. It was possibly the saddest face I had ever seen. The eyes seemed to look right through you, and he was dressed in all black. I've never felt so terrified in all my life. The curious thing is that Dick, my fireman, saw nothing at all. He coaled up for the hill at Wellwyn just as natural as though all was fair sailing. And when I tried to shout to him, I felt a great lump in my throat and not a word could I speak. I soon noticed that the stranger never went to any other part of the footplate except the spot where I stood. And then he edged up closer to me so that I went all cold. My feet were like lumps on ice. I think I must have acted mechanically because I watched the man put his hand on the regulator. I put my hand on his, and the touch of his hand was like ice, but I couldn't loosen his grip, and before I realized it, steam was being shut off and the brakes of the train were being applied and we were slowing down. Dick must have thought I was mad. He had been up on the tender breaking up coal, and he came down and craned his neck to see why we had shut the steam off. Then he saw what I saw, that the distant signal was off, and after that the home signal stood for line clear. You wouldn't believe it perhaps, but it's the gospel truth, and though I knew the way was clear, I felt compelled to stop the train, and stop the train I did just outside of Hitchin Station. For nothing, you say. Well, heaven alone knows how, but it proved to be for a great deal. There were 2 trucks derailed across the main line and right across the path of my train, and although the signals were set all clear, the line was blocked and a serious crash could have happened, and me and the passengers on the train wouldn't be living to tell the story if I hadn't been helped by the cold man who stepped into the cab and shut the steam off. Who he was, I will never know, but I am forever grateful for saving my life. This story happened in England during the Second World War. Mr. Anderson was an airman in the Royal Air Force and was stationed at an airbase in Lincolnshire as he travelled up by train from his home near Bedford. One foggy Sunday night in February, he caught a late train from an almost deserted Bedford station, as is often the case when one embarks from a dark, lonely platform. He had the feeling as the train steamed its way through the flat, fog-shrouded countryside that he was the only one on the train. After gazing out of the misty and dirty windows of the compartment for a while, he snuggled down in his RAF greatcoat and dozed off to sleep. The train normally took several hours to reach Lincoln, stopping and starting frequently at each subsequent station, although no one seemed to get on or off to join Mr. Anderson in his compartment, when all of a sudden the train came to a halt with an almighty jolt that awakened him immediately and nearly threw him onto the railway carriage floor. He looked around, but he was still alone in the compartment. He could hear the sound of rushing steam coming from the steam engine. Rubbing the misty window, he peered through it, but could make out only very little in the darkness outside. But it was plainly obvious to him that they were nowhere near a railway station. He sat for a while, wondering what could have caused that sudden halt, then pulled the strap which released the window and slid it down. Patting his head out the window, he gazed up and down the railway track. He could see nothing but fog-bound fields and a few lighted windows on the train he was on. Obviously, he was not the only one on it, but no one else seemed to have taken any notice of the abrupt stop. Then he heard the crunching of running footsteps along the ballast of the railway line, and a man appeared out of the mist nearly in front of the train. As he approached, Mr. Anderson could see that the man was wearing what appeared to be a dark uniform, that of a railway man, and was waving his arms about. He appeared to be frantically shouting something, although it was not easy to make out what he was saying. Then as he drew near, his words became clearer. "Runaway tracks!" he was shouting in a hoarse voice. "Runaway tracks!" Then he had gone, and was running towards the end of the train, soon disappearing into the mist. Almost immediately the train jerked into motion and continued its slow progress. Mr. Anderson sat back in his seat perplexed. Why had the train stopped suddenly, and just as suddenly started again? And who was the man running by the side of the tracks? What did he mean? Was there some danger? But no one seemed bothered. The driver of the train was obviously proceeding, despite the apparent warnings of the mysterious railwayman, albeit at a slow pace, but seemed unconcerned by the running man. But there was nothing that Mr. Anderson could do. He was in a compartment alone, in a non-corridor train, unable to communicate with anyone. The train arrived at Lincoln without further incident, and a few people got out, mostly military personnel, and went in search of the RAF lorries lined up in the station yard, which would take them to their respective air bases and army barracks in the county. Mr. Anderson, still puzzled about what he had seen from the train, joined his fellow RAF personnel as he climbed aboard his own lorry. He saw a group of friends. It appeared that they had travelled on the same train as him, although he had not seen them. They had also noticed the train stopping abruptly and thought one or two had looked out, but hadn't seen the running railwayman or heard his warning. He later made inquiries of all the airmen he could find who travelled on the train that night and discovered that he was the only one who had seen the running man or heard his shouts. After thinking about it for some time, he eventually decided he must have been half asleep when the train shuddered to a halt and imagined the rest of the incident. Years later, after the war had ended, he read a newspaper article of some railway tracks which had broken free in a siding the night before and had run away on the same railway line he was riding his train on that night, and these trucks smashed into an oncoming train coming the other way, killing the engine driver and a railwayman. Whether this be an echo commuting through the future to the past is a question we'll never have an answer to. What do you think? One midsummer's night in 1961, I intended to make some sound recordings of steam locomotives' work on the East Coast Main Line in the Grantham area. The exact location was dependent on the weather, and in the early evening I called Grantham Station to talk to an inspector I knew who worked there and told him I had decided to go to Barkston Junction and spend the night there. I asked the inspector for the relevant information on the steam train services during that night. It was dusk when I arrived at Barkston Junction, and I parked the car and walked around to decide on the best position for my microphones and other equipment. The south signal box was in darkness, which did not surprise me as I had been told that Grantham would be vacant from 10 p.m. But what did surprise me was that the door was open, so I walked over to the box thinking that plans might have been changed or that I had been misinformed. So I went to the box and said good evening to the signalman who was sitting inside just gazing out the window with his back to me. The signalman was starting to see me, so I explained the purpose of my visit and showed him my permit to be on railway property and asked for his opinion on steam train services for the night. The signalman seemed strangely disinterested and uncommunicative and started to talk about a girl who had recently been taken and had her life ended in the nearby woods by a man who was still at large. This was a complete surprise, because a killer on the loose was rare enough to be widely publicized, and I hadn't heard of this taking place, especially in the Barkston area. I didn't stay more than a few minutes because that signalman was really giving me the creeps. I walked down the trackside and found a good spot next to the railway line to set up my recording equipment, and it was 10:45 and nearly dark. During a long night's recording, I looked across the signal box from time to time, but at no time was it lit up, and all the signals under its control were permanently switched off during the night. By 5 a.m. I had to abandon recording because of the wind and rain, so I packed the equipment up and made my way back to the car. On my way back, however, I walked back across the signal box and found it deserted with the door locked. Later in the morning, when I called back to Grantham Station, I was again told that the Barkston South signal box was unmanned during that night. Then who the hell was the signalman that I saw gazing out the window to me, basically the whole night? I was a young apprentice at the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Locomotive Works at Horwich in the beginning of the 20th century. I had a strange experience on the work line. This began with an invitation to a footplate ride on a new locomotive's maiden run in recognition of my work. Horwich works were on a spur of about 4 miles from the main line. One winter day, the foreman asked me to join him on the footplate of the cab of a brand new tank engine. The cab contained inspectors, boilersmiths, the foreman, the duty driver, and firemen, so it was a bit crowded. I was to ride on the footplate and be on the lookout when they drove back to the bunker first. On the return journey, I saw a man walking in the track about 300 yards ahead. He was walking towards Horwich and had his back to the engine. I shouted to the driver to brake, and the driver responded quickly and whistled again. The man ignored the warning signal and walked on. I was so convinced that the engine had run over the man and taken his life that I stepped down from the engine after it had stopped and walked away. However, before long I heard my name being shouted, and then a great deal of laughter. Not only was there no sign of a body beneath the train, but no marks of footprints in the snow either. "Would you mind telling us how your friend can walk along the sleeper in 4 inches of snow without leaving a single footprint, mate?" they asked sarcastically. From that moment, I was the object of ridicule both at work and in my social life. Before long, the story of myself and the ghostly figure on the railway track spread around the town, and I was unable to tolerate the jeering to which I was subjected to. I left home and found work at the Morris Motor Car Company in Cowley. Almost a year later, I returned home and happened to relate my strange experience to the owner of the pub. I'd hardly finished the story when the publican asked his wife to fetch an old leather-bound book which contained the tale of a man seen walking along the work lines at Horwich in thick snow, who had been oblivious to a train's warning signal. That was 50 years to the day I had seen the apparition. I had just left school, and at the time this incident took place, it was mid-1960s, and I was able to find a job with British Rail as an apprentice signalman. However, my first duties saw myself very actively engaged in the removal of redundant signalling equipment, like signal boxes, as part of updating and modernising the post-war British railway service. I was working with 2 mates, Alf and Ron, who were older and much more experienced in the world of signalling expertise. These 2 men were to instruct me in the initial part of my training. This particular day was quite bright for December, and the 3 of us enjoyed the 10-mile journey to the local village where we had to dismantle the redundant signal cabin. The senior man, Alf, detailed to me to remove levers from the frame and load them into the British Rail van. At around 3 p.m, he asked if I would walk to the nearby village to grab them some cigarettes and chocolate, as the men wanted a break. So I set off for the village along the deserted railway line, which was by now rusting. One could see the rusted track through the overpowering spread of weeds and other undergrowth, and I reached the village, purchased the cigarettes and chocolate, and looked around the village when I started my way back, munching on my own bar of chocolate. I reached the old railway line and continued on my way, this time walking on the sleepers. It was beginning to get dusk, and the clouds were hastening at the end of a winter's day. I was about halfway back when I heard a noise that made my hair stand on end. The noise of a steam engine. Was it possible? I looked around and nothing was in sight. Then faintly on the slight breeze I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of a steam engine, and it was approaching. I knew that steam motive power had ceased in this area many years ago. Anyway, the line had been closed to all traffic for months, so what was an engine doing on the line now? I quickened my pace. I knew something was wrong, and I felt that I wanted to get as far away from here as possible. Panic set in when the sound of the engine appeared much louder, and I stumbled on the sleepers and fell face down. I could hear the locomotive as if it were almost upon me, and an amazing sequence of events evolved before my very eyes. The whole area was a haze of yellow light that seemed somehow menacing. I tried to get to my feet, but for some reason could not, and I heard the blood-curdling sound of the shriek of an engine's whistle. It split the December air with a piercing note, and then I saw the tall figure of a man dressed in a railway uniform wearing a black beret instead of the regulation railway hat. I thought the beret was like those worn by the soldiers of the Royal Tank Regiment. The figure stood in the track, seemingly rooted to the spot, and made no move to avoid the oncoming engine. There was a horrible piercing scream from the figure as the engine struck it and ground it to a pulp underneath it. At last I found my feet and ran as fast as I could back to the other men. I leapt through the door and collapsed in a heap on the floor, and when Alf revived me with a cup of strong tea, I poured my story out. "Don't be daft," they both scoffed. "I tell you, I saw him killed. And he was wearing a black beret like the tank regiment wear." Alf stroked his chin. "A black beret?" Then the recollections came flooding back to the two older men, and Alf recounted this story. "I remember now, about 9-10 years ago, there was a bloke killed doing track maintenance work round here, and he wore a black beret, and was quite well known. I think he might have been in the tank regiment during the war or something like that, but you wouldn't know anything about that now, would you?" I replied that it was a bit before my time, and they all laughed. Without further ado, we loaded the van and drove back to Darlington and vowed to never return to the area again. No further sign was seen of the phantom engine, and if it was, no one ever admitted to it. I was a volunteer on the Severn Valley Railway, and I kept having these reoccurring premonitions. In the first, I was standing on the footplate of number 43106, leaving Bridgnorth Smoke Box first, with some covered wagons heading for Bewdley. As the cab began to cross the bridge, the first full-span cross beam collapsed as a green Morris minor car was passing underneath. The cab was filled with steam and fire as the engine fell through the bridge. At this point, the premonition ended. The second again took place on footplate number 43106, leaving Bridgnorth. I was looking back along the train, and then I remembered the first premonition. I realized the impending danger and looked up the road where I saw a Morris Minor coming down the hill. I frantically told the driver to stop as the bridge was going to collapse, and when he refused, I jumped off the engine and watched it fall through the bridge onto the car, steam and smoke erupting from the cab as it did so. The first wagon fell onto the wreckage, and then the premonition ended. The third and final premonition was situated on the corner of Castle Walk. I saw an engine leaving Bridgnorth as a green Morris Minor coming down the hill towards the bridge. As the cab of the engine moved on the bridge, the engine fell through, the cab falling first and onto the car. It was passing underneath. After having that same premonition over and over again, I told my wife what I was seeing, and she told me that another volunteer was experiencing the exact same premonition of number 43106 collapsing through the bridge at Bridgnorth onto a green Morris Minor. So we decided that it was time to visit the bridge and examine it. We discovered loose rivets and serious fretting which had occurred between the main beam and the three first cross beams on the right-hand side only. The bridge had been cleaned and repainted 2 years earlier and was found to be sound. At the time, I was checking the bridge out of curiosity, and everything seemed to be in order, but on discovering the fretting, I informed the chief civil engineer, who imposed a strict speed limit on the bridge. A new bridge was fitted some 3 months later during the winter. About 6 months after my first premonition, I experienced unexplained noises, mainly thumping and banging. One night, me and my wife witnessed a vague aura of human form on the firebox on top of number 43106. It lasted about a minute before fading, and we both sensed a feeling of impending danger. After the bridge was repaired, Arnold, which we nicknamed him, disappeared. I believe that Arnold was the ghost of the future, possibly, or someone who was not supposed to die during the bridge collapse. In other words, the driver of number 43106, the driver of the green Morris Minor, or a ghost of myself. On another occasion, I had just gone to bed when I had the feeling that there was a fire on the site. I dressed myself, borrowed a torch and went outside, and I walked along platform 2 and noticed smoke coming from the signal box. By the time I reached it, the flames had started, and although the fire was put out in 20 minutes, about £3,000 worth of damage had been done, mainly to the electrical systems and the interlocking mechanism. Whether Arnold could have been blamed for the fire, I couldn't be sure, but his comings and goings certainly seemed to leave a trail of mystery and unease. For me, Bridge North will always be associated with the antics of a ghost that obviously liked railway engines and would appear from time to time to warn people of impending accidents. I was an Immingham goods guard, and I had signed on one night at 9:30 p.m. at the empty sliding guard's room. Then, having been told where my train of coal empties stood, I opened my locker and took up my large leather bag and my hand lamp, and then went outside and into the adjoining lamp room to trim my lamp. I then walked down my train to examine the couplings and pick up any handbrakes that might have dropped down as the trains were shunted. Reaching my brake van, I was pleased to see that it was a Great Central Railways brake van, which had quite a smooth ride to them, and not one of those old, rough-riding former Midland Railway vans that was somehow still in service. I lit my 2 side lamps and tail lamp, put some coal on the stove which had been lit for me by the front yardman, and walked down towards the other side of the train to repeat my examination. I stood at the front of the train to await the arrival of the engine, but did not have to wait long, and as the locomotive backed up carefully, I watched it buffer up to the train, and I then removed the engine tail lamp to save the fireman the job. As I climbed up the steps to the footplate of the locomotive, the driver greeted me. "You right, Edwin? How many empty wagons have we got on here tonight?" "Only 35, I reply. The fireman offered me a cup of tea from his brew, which I gracefully accepted. "Whistle up when you're ready, Fred," I said to the driver. "Draw up when the peg comes off and I'll get in." Minutes later, in the brake van, we were on our way. It was an uneventful trip for us to Stainforth, arriving and being relieved by another guard on time. In the old converted carriage mess room in the sidings, me and the driver and foreman joined other train crew waiting their turn to work home. After about an hour, I was told that our train was the next one coming in and that we should be arriving in a few minutes, so we gathered up our things and went outside to wait. We didn't have long to wait, as our train came into view, headed by one of the splendid former Great Central Railway 04 class steam engines. I proceeded to walk down the line past the oncoming train to relieve the guard. The coal train came slowly past, and I looked up to see to my disgust that the brake van was one of the hated former Midland Railway Rough Riders. I stood waiting for it to approach and came to a halt. I saw the train guard clamber down to greet me. "Right, mate, you got 30 on for West Marsh, a single load and you go in for a rough trip. The bloody thing rocks back and forth all over the place. Although I've tried to build up the fire for you, it's a bit cold and drafty." I thanked the guard and climbed up into the brake van and went inside. I looked twice at the huddled up figure opposite the guard seat, adjacent to the big brake wheel. Whoever it was evidently asleep, and I thought it was unusual that the guard I was relieving hadn't mentioned I'd be having company for the ride home. After all, it was nothing very strange for train crew to ride home in brake vans on occasion. However, I wasn't too bothered, and went outside on the veranda to wait for the driver to whistle up to signal their departure. On hearing the whistle, I held my headlamp out and waited for the whistle blast of acknowledgement from the locomotive, then went back inside the brake van, sitting down on my seat opposite my travelling companion. I could see little of the man in the dim interior, but could make out a uniform coat and a shiny peaked cap. I thought, I'll not disturb until we get to Guinness. He might be a Scunthorpe guard passing Thorn North. I went through my usual routine, going outside on the veranda to look at his train to see if there was anything unusual such as signs of hotboxes. But aside from the odd spark of a swinging brake block here and there coming into contact with a wheel, which was quite normal, everything was fine. Going back inside the brake van, I was about to sit down for a few minutes and have a few minutes of shut-eye when I noticed with a shock that I was alone. My travelling companion had gone. Whatever had happened? The brake van front door was still secured, with a wedge under the door bottom to make it hold firm in the existing frame, so he could not have gone out that way. I began to have doubts. Had the man existed? Could it have been a trick of the shadows? Had I imagined it? I began to think hard. I had seen the uniform and shiny cap. The figure had been real, right? For the rest of the journey, despite being bounced and banged on the corkscrew motion of the brake van, I couldn't take my mind off the experience. And now I'm very much a rational man. I certainly don't dislike mysteries. I look hard at the seat on the other side of the brake van, where my companion seemed to have occupied, and I willed the ghost to materialize again, but nothing. Perhaps I'd been dreaming. The crowded thoughts took my mind off everything until a lunch, and I realized that they had arrived at Westmarsh Sidings, and I knew I would leave the old brake van with its inexplicable presence to someone else. When the train came to a halt, I wounded down the brake wheel and climbed onto the ballast. I walked down the train to the engine and uncoupled between tender and train, then climbed onto the footplate. "Had a good ride, Edwin?" asked the driver. "Rotten. Not your fault, though," I reply. I was shaken up and banged about in that damn van, but I arrived knowing that I would get there in one lump, so I couldn't grumble. But I'll tell you this, I never want to use that brake again. I've got the van's number, and I'll take good care of that, but I'll never ride it again. I decided not to tell the driver and fireman about the mysterious figure because I'd only get ridiculed. As I left to go home, I couldn't resist going back to have a look at the old Midland brake van again. The moon had appeared from behind the scuttling clouds, briefly lit up the scene, and the solidness of the van seemed curious and ominous as I approached. Then I spotted something. I stopped in my tracks and my mouth fell open. There on vacation was a dark figure. It was the shadow of the veranda overhanging, but it was there. I ran forwards, convinced that someone was having a joke, but as I got nearer, to my amazement, the figure melted away into night and moon, which was again obscured by night clouds. About a year later, when I was talking to a Stainforth guard, I mentioned my experience. It appeared that the guard had also had this mysterious passenger on another occasion, and it was assumed that it was the ghost of a guard who had died in the brake van or something some years earlier. Evidently, the Stainforth men all knew about the apparition, but were not ungodly concerned about the phantom passenger who travelled home with an earthly colleague. This happened in Ramsey Hostel around 11:30 at night, July 1967. It was Wednesday, and Isle of Manzy Railway reopened, and I was feeling very emotional about the whole affair, with good reason, as the idea of the Isle of Man without a railway was quite unthinkable. I did actually get over to work for the Isle of Man Railway from 68 to 71, but the story I'm referring to happened in 1967, when I was just paying a visit and given a bed for the night in the hostel. There are two things to note about Ramsey Station. First of all, it's an extension line that harbours branches, had been closed 2 years before, and secondly, no steam engine was ever kept at the station overnight because the shed water supply hadn't been disconnected. So, I, and the only other lads in the dormitory, who were also railway enthusiasts, were being surprised and stunned to hear, just as we were slipping off to sleep, the sound of wagons being shunted into the station. To us, train fanatics were able to tell the sounds of the wagons because the wagons had different coupling systems in the Isle of Man compared to those in mainland UK, and they sound quite different. You don't get the clunk-clunk of links on a loosely occupied wagon, but a delayed clank as the chopper of one of the drops over the buffing plate to another. When you have listened to it as many times as we had, you recognize the unique plastic sound. At first, we only thought it was wagons, and we thought that it would be someone hand-shunting, but at this time of night? Also, we couldn't understand why, since there were only 3 trains a day each way, and only the 11:50 AM arrived, and the 4:05 which were heavy trains. We only knew for certain that there was something strange afoot when we heard the sound of a train being marshalled and it started coming towards the hostel. What is more terrifying was that it was travelling towards us at non-existent tracks. Had it been a real train, the sound would have faded off towards the west, away from the hostel instead, and we could now hear the chuffing of the steam engine as well. It came towards the hostel over the non-existent harbour branch line and clattered to a stop, perhaps at one of the wharves, and then we heard one final hiss of steam from the engine's safety valve, and then complete silence. There were 7 people in our dormitory, and I think 5 were awake. We all heard the mysterious sound without any doubt, but it appeared that none of the other inhabitants of the other dormitories heard anything at all. We of course went outside to see if we could see anything, not really expecting to. There was nothing to interest the passengers of a train, just the cool night air and distant sound of nightlife, nothing to prove or disprove the eerie sounds we had heard so clearly. It was wishful thinking. Or was it? Could I have been dreaming? I don't think so. We had been privy to a reenactment of the movements of a former worker during the old harbour branch, and although not frightening, we were very puzzled by the strange sequence of events. As a youth in the early 1950s, I wasn't very happy where my life was going, and dark and depressing thoughts took over my mind, which led me to come to the conclusion that I wanted to finish it. And I've always had a love of trains, so I thought it would be fitting if I appreciated the underside of a train with my own eyes for the first and last time. So one winter evening, as it was getting dusk, I set out on what I intended to be my final walk. I had gone out on the excuse that I needed urgent money order, otherwise my mum would certainly not have allowed me out so late. It seemed an ideal night for my purpose. A shallow mist was rising from the marshes, so that the bodies of the cattle grazing there looked as though they were floating like balloons above the ground. Yet the mist was not so dense that it would delay the trains, for the cabs of the engines would be above it, and the drivers be able to see the signals clearly. However, what they wouldn't see is me on the track. I came to the crossing and opened the gate. There was no one about. The track only went to a handful of bungalows and a couple of boatyards, almost deserted this time of year. I walked on the sleepers for about a quarter of a mile until I was almost opposite the home signal. My train was the 4:20 from Norwich to Yarmouth. I took off my cloak, rolled it up, and placed it as a cushion close to the outside rail. Then I took a lingering look at the darkening landscape around me. I could just see the lights of the village on the rising ground away from the river. Mist hid the station about half a mile up the tracks. Wilmington. I remember thinking how ironically appropriate it was. The scene of the worst railway disaster in Norfolk's history, when 2 trains met on a single track and 25 people exited this reality. With a sudden clatter, the signal arm fell, indicating a train had just entered this section of railway line. My train was on time, and I heard it whistling at the crossing by Thorpe Gardens. I knew that it would not stop at Wilmington, and so I knelt down on the track, bowing my neck to the rail. This position was by no means comfortable, though the folded cloak did give some support. Although I had the intention to watch the train in its relentless rush towards me, at the last moment, I don't know why, I turned my head away from the incoming train, and I was then confronted in the dusky light, about a yard away from my face, by the most hideous creature I have ever encountered. It was the face of a monster, a ghastly pale white mask with hollow, thick black eyes hanging disembodied in the mist. Its lips curled back, and mouth opened in a soundless snarl. I could see an array of sharp, pointed scarlet fangs, and the thing's breath stank of the evil of death. With a scream, I threw myself away from the creature and away from the train, which passed within just inches of my face. I lay prone for a number of minutes, panting for breath, my heart kicking at the walls of my chest. I hardly dare open my eyes to see whether the fiendish thing was still there. I could imagine it sniffing at my face, and smelt again its fetid breath, which, real or imagined, turned my stomach. At last I summoned the courage to open my eyes. Darkness had fallen, and now I could see nothing beyond the dull sheen of the rails. Trembling still, I rose to my feet, brushed down my clothes, picked up my cloak, and returned home. Recently, to a very few of my personal friends, I have been able to share this story. I was even able to provide a rational explanation for the monster. Could it have been one of those koipu who first invaded Norfolk? These hideous-looking rat-like creatures are as big as medium-sized dogs, and later became known as the scourge of the marshland farmers, but at that time they were vastly unknown. Although I believe I can make a convincing case for this explanation, there is something in me which I will never believe. My crisis of personality had been cured by the encounter. My psychiatrist, who I never shared this story with, was amazed by my suddenness of my recovery. I had managed to rid myself of the Mr. Hyde part of my personality, and my Dr. Jekyll self was never again troubled by a dull nature. Occasionally my meeting with my own personal devil has been reenacted in a nightmare, and then awakening in sweat and trembling. I know that I have seen a real image of hell, but I have escaped from the devil, sent to pursue me there. This story took place when I was a little girl. The gas lamps flickered in the slight breeze that stirred the night air as I stood with my mother on the platform of Harrogate Station on a dark and dismal night in the early 1920s. Suddenly out of the gloom, a man appeared beside us carrying a large suitcase. His face was partially covered by a scarf and the upturned collar of his long black raincoat, as he wore a shapeless trilby hat which had seen better days. "Are you waiting for the Leeds train?" he asked in a well-modulated but somewhat husky voice. My mother replied to him saying that we were. About 5 minutes later, the tank engine hauling the Leeds train steamed into the station, wheezing to a halt, and stood simmering. We climbed into a compartment occupied by a lady and gentleman. My mother put our modest luggage on the luggage rack, and we settled down on the dusty seats. A porter came along, slamming the doors and calling, "All stations to Leeds." Then the carriage door was opened, and the man with the suitcase who had spoken to us appeared. He thrust the suitcase at our feet and walked off into the night. My mother looked at the case with a puzzled frown on her face. "Does this case belong to you?" she asked the lady and gentleman. They stared at us and shook their heads. "Why, isn't this yours?" the gentleman asked, surprised. My mother replied that it had nothing to do with us, and glared at the large suitcase as if it were an object of menace. The train set off from the station, gathered speed and rattled into the night. The gentleman spoke up again. "I say, what a strange turn-up. Fancy leaving a thing like that here. Perhaps someone was picking it up in Leeds. I'll tell the guard when we stop." We all eyed the case with deepest suspicion, as if it would suddenly open up and attack us. Then I swallowed my fear and tried to see through the dusty window, but all I could make out was the reflection of others in the compartment. The lady spoke. "There was something in the papers last week about a case being found at a railway station, and later on when someone opened it, they found a dismembered body inside, a human body." I shuddered and moved closer to my mother, who pursed her lips and frowned. "What a thing to discuss! How horrible! I prefer not to think of such things." We all now gazed at the case in horror. What if it contained a body, or the remains of one? We moved our feet as away as we could. "We will be stopping at Panau shortly. Perhaps we can get rid of it there," suggested the gentleman. "I shall put it off there, shall I?" He looked at us, and we all glared. As the train came to a halt at Penal Station, my mother lowered the window and called the porter. He looked amazed as my mother told him the story, but to our relief he took it away, somewhat gingerly. We all sighed and looked at each other and smiled. Had we worried unnecessarily? Were we premature in our wild thoughts? As the worries slipped off our minds, we spent the rest of the journey speculating on what could have been in the sinister suitcase. Did it contain the remains of a body or the proceeds of a robbery? Would we ever know? At last, the train drew into Leeds and came to a halt. My mother and I stepped out onto the platform, gathered our luggage and said goodbye to our travelling companions, and then I turned to look up at the station clock. As I turned my head, my eye caught a glimpse of a very tall man in a black raincoat wearing a scarf covering most of his face. His collar turned up, a battered trilby pulled down over his eyes, coming towards us, clutching a large suitcase. He walked past us ominously and out the station. The whole thing remains a mystery, as we never saw this ominous figure again. It was during the summer months of 1968 that my father must have began taking me to Walton Junction, a railway station in Liverpool, to see what must have been the very last of the steam trains working in service in Great Britain, and they would thunder past at 7 o'clock. I loved trains, but I could remember the mounting excitement that I felt as we approached the path leading to the station, change suddenly to inexplicable fear. The path ran parallel to the lines and junction signal box northwards towards the station itself. The fear always came when I was about halfway down the path. There was a strange feel about the place, as though somebody or something was watching. It always seemed to mar our visits. The eyes even seemed to watch me during the autumn. I often picked wild blackberries at the end of the platform, and one particular beautiful Easter day, I remember an overwhelming fear filled me with absolute terror as we stood outside the ticket office after returning from a journey. It was indescribable, and I intensely disliked that spot ever since. During the damp November evenings when the gas lamps flickered in the wind, nothing would convince me that danger wasn't lurking in the eerie shadows. During the summer of 1975, I visited the station one day when we had nothing particular to do, with two friends. I was astonished when we began walking down the now weed-strewn path to feel a familiar feeling. Both my friends felt that there was something unusual about the place, and we quickly departed. A few weeks later we returned, this time with a third friend, a very level-headed girl. We told her nothing of our horrible experience, and this time we settled in the deserted waiting room, which was silent and cold. After a very short time, we all felt a horrible feeling of being watched, and an intangible atmosphere of doom. My third friend was very scared and wanted to leave at once, feeling that we were in definite danger from something. We left as darkness was descending on that foreboding place, and nothing could have made us stay or convinced us that there wasn't something awful waiting on the station. Recently, I returned to Walton Junction with my children to get the train to Ormskirk. We used the same old path, and I was amazed to realize that without knowing it, I had been hurrying my children along and constantly looking over my shoulder. I was convinced something was following us, though nothing was visible. We paused on the small bridge which led to the ticket office. I looked at the now derelict railway cottages which stood silent, lost and forlorn. The feeling of fear had subsided somewhat, and I remembered looking into the rubble-strewn backyards and thinking how sad it was that they were now a ruin, as the last time I was in the station they were occupied. Suddenly we all heard a loud bang from the back bedroom of the second cottage, as though a door had been slammed hard. It was a cold day with no wind. We waited to see if anyone came out, maybe a cat or dog, but everywhere was silent and still. There was so much rubbish and broken glass littered around there anyway. It would have been difficult for anyone to climb out without making lots of noise. So we left and resumed our journey. The uncanny, oppressive atmosphere still hangs over that spot, as it has done for over 20 years. But what exactly it is that gives off this sinister feeling, I cannot say. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed our older train stories. Huge shout out to Rowan Griff, who provided me with these stories. I really appreciate it, man. Thank you. If you'd like to hear even more stories from me, you can find a link in the description down below. And if you'd like to support the channel and get extra content, you can check out the links in the description too. But for now, stay awesome guys, and I'll see you in the next one.